Hello, everyone. Today, we are talking about why it is so important for us to prioritize wellness, not only in our individual lives, but in our interpersonal lives, as well as our organizational lives as well. So, we're going to talk about why focus on wellness in the workplace, especially as library workers, as individuals who are in cultural art spaces. We're also going to talk about what are some frameworks and models that can help us understand the different dimensions of wellness and why we need to tend to each of them. We'll talk about, okay, we know that we need to take care of wellness and self-care in our individual lives, but what does that look like at a collective level, at an organizational level? And then how do we find ways to operationalize that and institutionalize that? That is the scope for today. I'm really excited to be talking with you all because as a social worker, as a human being that's also navigating these strange and weird and traumatic times, I know that it is just of the utmost importance that we are talking about wellness. We are talking about mental health, that we are thinking about how we pivot as individuals and as a society to make sure that we are prioritizing that for ourselves and our communities. This is a big question. I feel like it's a question that is, I don't know, we have sort of our default responses to it. We're like, how are you? And we're like, oh, fine, right? But I want us just to take a pause, right? I want us to take a deep breath, maybe the deepest breath we've taken today. Just inhale and exhale, maybe audibly. And we'll do that again. Take a deep as you can, as deep as your lungs are willing to let you. And maybe this time when you're exhaling, exhale like you are getting off the phone with someone that you can't stand, that you are finally at the end of a very long day. Just inhale and let it out with the deep noise. And I want us just to take a brief moment to tune into where we are in this question, right? Because like I said, I think sometimes we answer this very automatically, right? We're like, oh, how are you? Fine. How are you? Tired, right? But we don't know what is it that is fatiguing us, right? What is it that's bringing us joy in these moments? If you're feeling stressed and anxious and overwhelmed, you're not alone, right? You're not alone if things feel tough, because it is tough. A lot of people I know, too many people that I know are not okay. They are doing the best that they can, but they're not tending to their well-being, in part because they don't have the tools and the language to do so. And so as a social worker, I know that this can be damaging at an individual level, but at a societal level as well, at a communal level. And so it's important to think about the fact that we need to care for our well-being and our mental health, especially those of us with identities that have been historically and contemporarily marginalized or minoritized. We as a society are experiencing collective trauma in a lot of ways, as we talked about the last time, and our bodies are responding to it all of the time. The question is, are we listening to what our bodies are telling us? And do we know how? So prioritizing our well-being, prioritizing our communal well-being, that has to be of the utmost priority right now. Because by tending to our well-being, by tending to the well-being of our communities, we not only give our brains reprieve to be more present in meetings and relationships and conversations and decision making, but we also create the capacity for us to heal, despite, alongside, in spite of what we're all experiencing. And so I want us to spend just a moment to not only check in with ourselves, but to try and self-regulate as much as we can in the little time that we have together. As I talked about the last time, I typically start meetings, conversations, workshops, etc., with a mindful moment, because I know that we are all so dysregulated. And so if we are to be connected to one another, even if virtually, we need to give ourselves that little bit of moment to regulate. And so we're going to do a little bit of movement practice. So we're going to do a little bit of chair yoga. But before that, I want us to tune into where we are, right? And so this is an example of a tuning scale. And I am a student of embodiment. I won't get into what embodiment is. I think I touched on it last time a little, very briefly. But one things I've learned from a few of my embodiment teachers, specifically Prentice Hemphill, is that emotions are our reactions to our internal and external stimuli. And so they're not a neutral place. They're happening to all of us all the time, and we're constantly determining what emotions we can express and what emotions we cannot express. I think we get confused in terms of thinking that when we are expressing emotions, it means we can't be rational. But that's not true, because emotions actually tell you what you care about. They tell you how to prioritize the things that are inside of you and what action that you might need to take. Your emotions might be saying, this is important to me, this isn't important to me, I need to fight for this, I care about this, right? I think we default to using our strategic analytical brains, but first we have to care. So our emotions actually really support our thinking selves too. And if we're not practicing understanding and reading our emotions, then we're missing out on the information that they can provide us. And so this is a tuning scale for us to just check in with ourselves right now in this moment, without judgment, just with acceptance and awareness of where we are and how we're showing up. So up top, there are some positive emotions, things like feeling empowerment, happiness, strength, hope, and then some negative emotions. And the reason that these are in quotations is because we are socially conditioned to think that some emotions are negative and some emotions are positive. But emotions are our bodies responding to what's going on. And then we assign narratives to those reactions, to those sensations that tell us, oh, this is bad or this is good, right? And instead of thinking about what is this actually telling me about what am I experiencing and what I need to feel something different if that's what I want, right? Or to really tap into this feeling. So just very briefly, take a look at the scale, tune into where you are before we do a little bit of just stretching. I love body movement because it helps us get into our bodies and our breath and connect them, as well as stretching when a lot of us are constricted, either because we're constantly hunched over in our desks, or for driving a lot, or for squatting to shelve books, right? Just thinking about what our bodies might need and how our body's sensations are connected to our emotions and our feelings. Because sometimes different emotions can be stored in different places in our bodies. So we're going to do a very brief round of some chair yoga. As I mentioned last time, I am a trauma-informed yoga teacher, and really think that yoga is a tool to not only allow us to be more mindful and present, but to also rewire a lot of our neurological processes. And so I'm going to invite you to get into a comfortable position that serves you and your body right now. Again, check in with yourself, maybe using that scale that was on the previous slide. I can go back to it for a second. Thinking about where you are, if you're feeling stuck, if you're feeling a sense of blame, a sense of relief or confidence, wherever it is, just note where you are, see it, notice it, right? Without judgment, without attributing a judgment towards it, and just note where you're starting. And then I want you to take a look around whatever space that you might be in. Assess where you are to see if you feel relatively safe for now, relatively able to lean into the next 45 or so minutes. Are you aware of your surroundings? And we're gonna just do a couple stretches to stretch, to get grounded. We'll start with a crescent moon pose. This gives you a deep stretch in your sides, allows you to lengthen your spine, and allow you to have stronger concentration. I feel like sometimes we don't spend enough time doing twists, and so we're not really massaging our internal organs like we might need to be. And so what you're going to do is you're going to begin by lifting your arms overhead, if that feels good and available to you. And then I'm going to invite you to connect the palms and stretch your fingers as wide as feels good in your body. And then you're going to gently lean to one side for 2 to 3 deep breaths. So I'm going to start leaning this way. And I'm going to do my best to lean up and then out to the side. And it's not a competition or challenge to see how far you can go to one side, but to really think about what your body needs and what feels good and juicy for you right now. And if you want a little bit more, maybe stretch up and then bend a little further. We're going to return back to center and then repeat it on the other side. So we're going to stretch up and then to the side. And just take 2 or 3 deep breaths, trying to breathe into that side body. Maybe trying to tap into some feelings in our side body that we might not usually notice. And if you want to, maybe extend a little bit further, a little bit more out. And when you feel ready, you can return to center. Or you can hear the birds chirping. I feel like there's always birds that are following me. Now we're going to do a cat and cow pose. This helps calm the mind and body by linking our breath to movement. I find that in what practitioners and researchers and people who have come up in traditional yoga practices say, when you are linking your body movement with breath, it can help calm your body and help self-regulate. So I want you to sit up tall with your hands in your lap and just inhale and arch your spine. Oof. Open your chest and lift your chin as far as feels good for you. And hold your spine. This is a wonderful way to mobilize the spine, to ease that back tension. So we'll do it a couple more times. Inhale, chin up, chest forward. Exhale, round that spine, or drop that chin to your chest. And I like to rock because it helps me find my center and feel grounded. And if that feels good to you, go ahead and do that. If not, that's fine. We'll do one more breath. Inhale, chest up, chin out. Exhale, round the spine, dropping that chin to chest. And the next thing that we'll do, or the last thing that we'll do, is just to stretch our neck to free up some of the tension. So what I want you to do is to lift your neck to one side at about a 45-degree angle. So think about your neck touching the top of the wall opposite to where your chin is at. So right now, my chin is pointing to my right. And then if it feels good, you're gonna put your hand, the opposite hand, on the top of your head and just gently rest it there. You don't want to put too much pressure. Maybe pretend that your hand is the hand of a loved one, just lightly massaging your head. Take a couple breaths here. And when you're ready, we're going to do it on the other side. So drop your other ear to your shoulder. Take your opposite hand, place it gently on the top of your head, and take a couple deep breaths. And allow yourself to just loosen here. You can rest in this moment. You can be in this moment. You can be supported by this moment. And trust that whatever it is that you need to receive in the next bit of time that we have together will find its way to you. And then when we're ready, we'll return back to center. Maybe shake it out a little bit if that feels good. Slowly open your eyes if they were closed and re-find yourself in whatever space that you're in. And we'll move into the rest of our conversation. Maybe tune into where you are and if it's different than where you were starting. If so, why? If not, also why, right? Tune into whatever information your body is telling you and giving you right now. So again, an example of how we take a trauma-informed approach to even starting conversations, to starting meetings. We talked about trauma-informed practice last time, which, to reiterate or to summarize very briefly, a trauma-informed approach to our work recognizes that every choice we make, every interaction we have, every policy create, everything that we do, they either have the potential to be re-traumatizing or healing for our patrons and for each other. And so it's important for us to think about how are we intentional about creating the necessary shifts in our work, in our organizations, and how we show up and convene so that we are prioritizing healing and well-being in all that we're doing. And so I think something that's important to name and something that I think about a lot is the fact that one, we are all facing so many challenges, right? And in order to really meet the needs of those challenges, we have to shift our values, and we have to shift our ability to actually heal from the wounds that are caused by oppression, the wounds that are caused by systemic failings. And so on the screen is a quote by Sean Ginwright, who is one of the nation's leading thought leaders on African American youth activism, and youth development. There's a couple of quotes that I continuously draw on and have drawn upon for the last few years because I think that they're really just important to share in their fullness. But one of the things that he talks about that comes from his newest book, The Four Pivots, Reimagining Justice, Reimagining Ourselves, is that eliminating things that harm us is not the same as creating things that heal us. Right? A lot of organizations, again, they're trying to transform around these commitments to equity, to social justice, to liberation. But that can't happen if we're not healing. We can't wait until these changes, whether they be at the policy level or at the interpersonal level, we can't wait until these changes happen to heal. Because hurt people in a new system or structure are going to inevitably replicate the unhealed harm that they've experienced. So we have to think about what work do we need to be doing as individuals, right? As communities, as organizations, as societies, and as institutions. And so that is why I think it's important for us to not only have a trauma-informed lens, right? Understanding the role that trauma plays in lives, right? And understanding how trauma can impact us, but also how do we think about prioritizing healing? Because getting rid of trauma doesn't mean that healing is happening. And so another quote from his book, he says, "We don't do a really good job at preparing, teaching, or training people how to be vulnerable, cultivate empathy, practice self-reflection, all of the stuff that makes us human. Healing involves more than repairing the deep wound of racism, oppression, sexism, homophobia, all of the isms, right? Healing the scars of sexism, easing the pains of poverty, all of that requires the capacity to restore our humanity and care for ourselves and others, even in the midst of fear. Because healing is the only pathway to real justice. It requires that we take an honest look at ourselves and what harmed us and pushes us to restore our humanity and finally move confidently into a more possible future." And so this is a calling for a framework that focuses and prioritizes healing, right? It is an extension of what a trauma-informed approach is. One of the things that Dr. Sean Ginwright talks about is how he talks about the limits of trauma-informed care, which isn't to say that it isn't to negate the importance of trauma-informed care or why it is valuable. It is to say that there are limitations, right? And how do we move past those limitations? And so he talks about how he was facilitating a trauma-informed healing circle with a group of young Black men. And during one of the sessions, he was talking about this is what the impacts of stress on the body are. This is the impact of trauma on brain development. This is how trauma can impact one's emotional health. And as he was explaining this, one of the young Black men was like, "Hey, I am more than what happened to me. I'm not just my trauma." He was calling attention to the fact that the term or even the framework of trauma-informed care doesn't really encompass the totality of one's experience. It's focusing primarily on their harm and their trauma. And in using that approach is sort of minimizing people to the worst thing that's ever happened to them. And it is kind of deficit based rather than really focusing on the strengths and the assets that are available and present in individuals and communities. And so from that conversation, Dr. Jen Wright expanded trauma-informed practice to really focus on healing-centered practice. This expands how we think about and respond to trauma in a way that is really holistic and is really focusing on collective well-being. And so it's non-clinical, it's a strengths-based approach that really recenters culture and identity as a central aspect of well-being. And so it views trauma not as something just happening to in the individual, but thinking about how trauma happens collectively. And it reframes trauma so that we're understanding what it is that we need to be doing to disrupt the internalized Western ways of approaching trauma that we might all be carrying, right? And so I really like this as a framework in terms of thinking about how do we not only understand the effects of trauma, but how do we get to a place of healing and set that as the direction that we're moving towards. And so when we're thinking about why do we need healing, why do we need to talk about that in workplaces, some things to note. US workers are some of the most stressed employees in the world. Gallup does their State of Global Workplace report, which captures how people are feeling about work and life over the past year. And it showed in 2021 that employee engagement dipped in the rest of the world, but rose to 34% in the US. What this also means is that if there's a higher level of engagement in an organizational culture, but also higher stress, that can lead to burnout, that can lead to mental health challenges. The study also showed that US and Canadian workers, because those groups, their data is combined in these polls, the US and Canada ranked the highest for daily stress levels of all of the groups that were surveyed. So about 57% of US and Canadian workers reported feeling stressed on a daily basis, which was up 8 percentage points compared to the previous year. And it also revealed that rates of daily stress, rates of worry, sadness, and anger have been on the increase or have been trending upward for US workers since 2009. And so when we think about the pandemic and also all that has happened over the last 3 years between concerns over the virus, concerns over financial insecurity, concerns around racial injustice and racial trauma, all of that compounded in terms of the stress and the trauma that people were feeling. And so this correlation again of higher engagement, but also higher stress leads to burnout and mental health challenges. And so that there needs to be conversation around, okay, how do we not only cope, right, but how do we heal from some of the traumas that we're all experiencing? Because one of the other things that was revealed was that roughly 1 in 12 US adults reported symptoms of an anxiety disorder at this time last year. So this would have been in 2020. And now it's more than, as of 2021, now more than 1 in 3. So there's this heightened increase of individuals experiencing anxiety and stress. So again, we need those tools to cope and to heal. Another thing that we need to be thinking about, if we're talking about trauma-informed community engagement, right? Understanding how trauma might be manifesting, helping individuals navigate their trauma. That means that we also are going to be impacted by that. And so we're impacted in different ways. And this is when our experiences are overlapping or are impacted by the people that we are encountering, the people that we're serving. That means we're going to be more vulnerable to vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, and burnout. Vicarious trauma is the indirect trauma that happens when we are exposed to difficult images, difficult situations, when we hear different stories. Compassion fatigue is that compounding emotional and physical erosion when people are unable to refuel and regenerate after continuously hearing stories of trauma, experiencing vicarious trauma. It's that cumulative level of secondary trauma. And then we have burnout, which isn't necessarily always attached to or associated with trauma, but is shaped by the emotional exhaustion one might feel because of their increased workload and institutional stress. And so that's one of the things that I'm hearing from library workers, right, is that regardless of whether or not they're navigating or serving customers who've experienced trauma, is that there is increased exhaustion and increased workload stress. And so these are just some of the ways in which we are impacted by doing this work. Research shows that compassion fatigue has a more rapid onset, while burnout is sort of emerges over time and takes much more time to recover from. Compassion fatigue has a faster recovery. It's less severe in some ways if recognized and managed early. But it's important to note the different things or the different ways in which we're impacted by doing this work. So those are some of the negative ways in which we might be impacted, but there are also positive impacts as well. Vicarious resilience is the unique and positive effect that transforms social workers in response to trauma survivors' own resiliency. It's so when research shows that when psychotherapists were working with victims and families who had experienced political violence, that witnessing their clients' ability to overcome their challenges and adversity actually led them to heal and had a positive impact on the person themselves, the therapist themselves. And so it's thinking about how not only can working with communities who are experiencing trauma result in some of those negative outcomes, right? But if we're creating the ability for individuals to heal and to demonstrate strength and resilience in the face of that trauma, that can be healing for those who are serving them as well. And so this means that by promoting community healing, that can lead to our own healing, which in my head feels like a win-win. So when we experience trauma and we don't have those resources, that is when we see those trauma symptoms. And those are typically those more negative symptoms, whether it's substance use, increased mental illness and mental unwell-being, increased stability in other ways. But when we experience a trauma or a trigger and there are resources, that is when healing actually happens. And so what are some of those resources? Resourcing is the antidote to trauma activation. It's how we try and get to a feeling of okayness, right? What we need to feel solid, to feel good, to feel supported, to feel neutral. And we resource through different ways, through orienting. We did that the last session with the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 exercise, noticing what's happening internally in our bodies as well as externally in our bodies. We resource through mindful movement, so doing things like yoga, like going for mindful walks, like dancing, through mindfulness exercises like meditation, visualization, centering practices, art therapy, as well as breathing exercises. These things help to self-regulate our nervous system. And if we practice them when we're not only in moments of dysregulation, it becomes easier to activate them when we're in feelings of stress and trauma, right? When we're feeling triggered and activated. When we have the resources, when we know what allows us to feel better or to feel as okay as we can, and we're activated because of a trauma or trigger, then we're able to not demonstrate that trauma response if we have the tools to navigate and to self-regulate. And so one of the things that I talk about a lot is self-care planning. And I think that our individualistic culture sets us up to think that self-care or healing is individual. It's been really commodified and put into this capitalistic structure where it's like getting massages and getting your nails done and all of those things. But I don't think that is what self-care is. Self-care is doing whatever it is that you need to do to feel as okay as you can, right? It's tending to your emotional, physical, spiritual, financial, all of those needs. It's tuning into yourself and responding accordingly. And so I think it's important that we reconceptualize and reframe what self-care looks like away from the ways in which it might be portrayed in social media, and media in general, the ways in which it's sold to us and packaged, because it is the most important tool that we can activate right now. And the word says self-care, but self-care is collective care as well, right? Part of our self-care practice can be engaging in collective and communal healing and self-care. And so when I think about defining self-care, again, it's doing whatever you need to do for yourself in order to return to a more balanced state of well-being, creating those rituals for persistence and resistance so that we can navigate all of what we're experiencing, but also sustain ourselves as we're trying to fight and build a better tomorrow. And so there are sort of different components of self-care. We have self-regulation, which is more of the physiological practice, which I just talked about in the previous slide. So this is how we monitor and manage our energy states, our emotions, our thoughts, and our behaviors in a way that's actually going to contribute to our well-being, contribute to us having healthy relationships. And so it's our ability to manage disruptive emotions and impulses, our ability to think before we act. when we are self-regulated, we feel grounded, we feel centered, we feel present, right? And the moments that we're in. We're operating not from our lizard brain, the one that's really reactive, but really thinking about how are we tapping into our sense of groundedness. When we're thinking about self-compassion, that is more of the psychological process. And so this is when we are able to tune into what we're experiencing, care and kindness and compassion towards ourselves, where we're able to understand what's happening without self-judgment and recognize that what we're experiencing is part of the human experience, right? We're not shaming ourselves for how we're responding to whatever it is that we're navigating. And then self-care are the actions that we take. So this is how we're actively taking a role in protecting our well-being and protecting our happiness. Each are a component of self-care, right? Being able to grant us the self-compassion to understand that there are actions that we need to take in order to feel more grounded, to feel that sense of stability and security and safety. And so the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration has identified 8 dimensions of wellness. And I think this is such a great holistic approach to understanding wellness and self-care. We've got our emotional wellness, financial, social, spiritual, occupational, physical, intellectual, and environmental. Everyone is going to require a unique balance of each of these different dimensions to have whatever is their good state of harmony. And if we are not paying attention to one area, that can negatively impact other areas, right? If we're not thinking about our financial well-being, our physical well-being, our occupational well-being, our emotional well-being, all can suffer. And so it's important for us to think about, as we're thinking about designing our own self-care practices and plans, but also thinking about the organizational wellness needs of our communities, how are we doing it in a way that is mindful of the different aspects of wellness? I think oftentimes we default to physical and emotional well-being, which isn't to say that that is wrong, that we shouldn't be focusing on those things, but those aren't the only aspects of well-being. One of the things that can be helpful is doing a self-care checkup. So the Mental Health America Association has this self-care worksheet that's divided into 5 aspects of emotional wellness. There's one in the resource kit that is linked at the end of this slide deck that is broken into the complete 8 dimensions, but it's a way for you to check in and see where you are. So there's different aspects of emotional self-care. It's not an exhaustive list of practices, but you can identify, this is something that I rarely do, this is something that I sometimes do, this is something that I often do, this is something that I would like to do. And so it's a way for you to assess where you're starting in order to plan where it is that you might need some improvement or be wanting to go. Building onto that is if we assess where we are with our self-care behaviors and practices, we can then ritualize it, right? We can assess, okay, where am I at in this dimension of well-being when I'm thinking about my physical self-care? If these are practices for maintaining my overall health and the well-being of my body, how would I rank myself in terms of, I am really prioritizing this, or this is an area that's lacking? And based on that rating, how can I identify what I might need to do to shift or improve that? So some examples, when I look at my self-care behavior chart, because I try and do it quarterly, I was like, okay, I want to improve how many steps I'm taking a day. I feel that I've been very sedentary. And so what is something that I can do? Set that goal of taking 10,500 steps a day. And then how do I measure and monitor my progress and hold myself accountable? I have my Apple Watch. It's set up so that it's alerting me on the hour that I could take my steps. And then I know at the end of the day how many steps that I've taken. Professional self-care. If I know that I'm not taking lunch breaks, one of the things that I try to do is set times in my schedule where I was taking lunch breaks every day. I still found that I was not doing it. But once I invited a colleague and we had a standing reoccurring lunch break, I felt more accountable to that. And that was a way for me to really meet myself in that challenge. And so thinking about, what is the dimension of wellness that I can be focusing on? Where am I currently at? What is something that I can do to support this aspect? And then how can I hold myself accountable to that? Another area of well-being and wellness, and again, these are examples at the individual level, we'll talk about at the organizational level as well, is thinking about our triggers and our glimmers. Our triggers, as I think most of us know, those are the things that signal a potential threat, right? They are the things that are going to activate our flight, fight, freeze response. But the opposite are the glimmers, the things that are going to cue and signal safety, those soft moments that you can go back to that help you feel good or good enough, the things that are going to help soothe your brain so you can survive and navigate whatever state of chaos that you might be in. And so while we're able to really identify our triggers, I think we could use more practice in identifying our glimmers. And if we are practicing activating or identifying our glimmers, it's easier to access those things when we are feeling triggered. So they can be an antidote to our triggers in some ways. So one way that I do this is that I have a collection of Post-its that are on my door of some of the things that feel like self-care for me, the different glimmers that I have. And I have in the second panel a weekly calendar, and so I try to ensure that I am tapping into 4 glimmers a day. And because they're on the post-it notes, because it's right there, it cues me in that, oh, there's 4 blank spaces. I have not activated a glimmer today. Oh, I can't think of what is going to feel good. Here are some examples because it's top of mind right there. And then at the end of the week, I can look and see, oh, okay, this is how I took care of myself. I can see, oh, I really emphasize, because part of what it's divided out into is different dimensions of well-being and wellness. I try and focus on 4 each week. So for instance, this would be mental, physical, intellectual, spiritual, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. And so I look and say, oh, okay, I tapped into my emotional well-being every day last week, but when it comes to my physical well-being, maybe not so much. What can I do to pivot next week based on understanding where I am and what my body might need? But I also want to emphasize that we can't self-care our way out of systemic shortcomings. So these recommendations are a both and approach. We all can play a role in maintaining our well-being, but we also need agency, we need time, we need space, we need resources and organizational cultures that are going to support our ability to be well. And it's really up to the leadership within our respective institutions to make that choice as available as possible to us. Gallup, as part of their annual workplace survey, has identified some elements that are important for organizational well-being. So that's career well-being, ensuring that individuals that work in your organization like what they do each day. There's social well-being, ensuring that individuals that work in your organization have strong relationships. Financial well-being, people are making wages that provide financial security, right? They're not having that financial anxiety. Physical well-being, that they have enough energy, that they're not working hours where they're constantly tired, right? They're not working in physically in workspaces that are damaging or could harm their physical health. And then community well-being, that they are attached to and engaged in their community. And when there's stress in any of these areas, for instance, if there's stress in terms of equitable pay or stress when it comes to unsafe work environments, that can negatively impact a worker's health. And so what organizational leaders can do is to do an audit. They can use surveys, they can use focus groups to see if any of their company policies, their communication tools, their structures, their programs, if any of them are negatively impacting their overall employee well-being. And when they are trying to introduce new interventions or offerings, assessing whether or not they're contributing to these 5 elements of well-being, so that people are understanding, why are you providing these various benefits, and why is that contributing to an overall thriving culture? Some things that Gallup talks about in terms of what are the catalysts to well-being. So asking questions like, do our development plans include well-being goals? When people are participating in activities that promote well-being, are we celebrating that? Do people feel incentivized to engage in well-being initiatives or offerings? Are there events that are building awareness around how the organizational culture is pivoting around a commitment to well-being and healing? Are facilities easily able to be moved around? Do people feel that there are spaces to collaborate? How are communications, especially from people managers, from leaders, are they consistent with this prioritization of well-being? Based on looking at these catalysts of well-being, as well as the components of organizational well-being, some examples, it becomes easier to create examples of how to actually operationalize that, which I'll show in this next slide. When it comes to how can people managers, people who are responsible for other people, promote well-being, it's understanding those components, right? And those catalysts, but also normalizing conversations around well-being, being able to facilitate dialogue around what wellness means for an organization and why we're focusing on it. Again, incentivizing, prioritizing well-being, creating opportunities for people to share about the different ways in which they're prioritizing well-being, and ensuring that that shows up in goal setting and milestones and work reviews. This is a very, again, this is part of the Gallup workplace survey that came out in 2021. And so if folks are interested in looking at it more thoroughly, it's linked in the slide deck. But they looked at what are some of the different things that organizations could do at the peak of COVID that were in alignment with not only the different well-being elements, but also the catalyst of well-being. So looking at things like, okay, when we're thinking about our financial well-being, do we have policies that promote childcare support? Do we have policies that promote long-term loan temporary payment? When it comes to our physical well-being and thinking about our facilities, are we ensuring that our workplaces have communal areas where people are able to congregate and do that in a way that feels safe and hygienic? When we're thinking about our social well-being and our development, are we prioritizing engaging in these areas of social supports as part of developmental goal planning? So really thinking about how do we align not only the well-being element with the different area in terms of what is going to facilitate well-being at an organizational level. And so one way to really think about this or to sort of practically operationalize this is thinking about what a culturally responsible wellness model might look like. I conceptualize a culturally responsible wellness model to these three components: having access to wellness resources. So every individual in the organization has access to resources that are going to meet their needs, but they also have access to social supports. And that relationship building and social connection is emphasized through a variety of social support networks. And that folks have access to ongoing mental health education. They're learning the coping and life skills that are going to help facilitate whatever changes or whatever things folks might be experiencing, and that supervisors and leaders as well have adequate training in terms of being able to support their teams as they're navigating different challenges. And so when I say culturally responsive, what I mean is that we know that culture is central to how we move through the world. It's core to who we are. And so a culturally responsive wellness model not only factors in the culture, right? Thinking about what shapes culture, but it also intentionally centers communities that have been historically decentered and marginalized. It's one that is designed to meet the needs of the individual in the community in whatever specific time. So it's consistently evolving with the needs of the culture in that current moment. And it is responding to the different ways in which social and political events may have differing impacts on individuals, right? Depending on our social identities, different individuals within our organization are going to need different levels of support. And so in order for our wellness approach to be culturally responsive, we have to contend for that as well. And so it is challenging the oppressive and disruptive patterns and systems of well-being that are going to get in the way of one's well-being and wellness. And so I'll wrap with some examples of how I've worked with organizations in the past in terms of developing a culturally responsive wellness model and integrating these components into their organizational structures and really aligning around that. Wellness resources that could look like providing access to culturally responsive and inclusive wellness apps, providing staff with quarterly wellness hours so they can actually engage in wellness activities, providing staff with support to on-call mental health supports. I know that not a lot, but libraries are more moving towards the approach of integrating community social workers, right? Knowing that communities need that support, but what does it look like to have potentially a social worker that is available to staff? As well as providing and increasing access to wellness classes, thinking about what are the things that are made available, what are the needs of our staff and our communities, and how can we ensure that that access is there. When it comes to social supports, that can look like offering monthly healing spaces for staff, even if it's not under the guide of this is a self-care committee, right? It can be naming it whatever is relevant for your group, but also ensuring that one of the core components is creating that space for social connection. Establishing peer-to-peer mental health support, so providing folks with training in mental health first aid and having a team or a committee of folks who can support staff, that staff know that they can connect with if they are struggling with different things. Creating affinity groups that staff can utilize on work time so that they're able to come together and connect with people who have shared lived experience, and integrating mindful moments into meetings. So starting and grounding together so that folks are feeling connected to what they're doing and to who they're in conversation and collaboration with. And then lastly, mental health education. Examples: providing access to healing-centered training for all staff, requiring that supervisors and managers are engaging in routine mental health training on topics like trauma-informed supervision, preventing and managing burnout, supporting employees that are navigating that, ensuring that staff have information on how to access the employee assistance program. Sometimes what I'll see is that there is an EAP, but people don't know the scope of it, how to utilize it, what is available to them, as well as providing that mental health first aid training so that folks can be aware of signs of mental unwellness in themselves, but also in their community members, whether that's the people that they're working with or the communities that they're serving. In summary, it's up to us as individuals to check in with ourselves, to determine and communicate our needs, and to take advantage of what we have access to in our organizations. When we think about interpersonally, so at that community level, it's up to us to model healthy wellness behaviors, as well as to encourage our colleagues to do the same. But it's also up to our organizational leaders to create and maintain cultures that prioritize well-being. Over the last two sessions, or today and the last session, my goal was to give you a background on trauma, as well as community healing, and to think about how do we ensure that we are integrating a trauma-informed lens into our community engagement work, as well as a healing-centered lens. And how are we ensuring that we are taking the steps towards ensuring that we are taking care as we engage in this work? So I hope that you all use these tips to advance and enhance your ability to support positive change in your communities, the communities that you serve, and that you continue to chip away at structural inequity, at violence, and the barriers that are created by trauma, and that you're able to contribute to healing at all levels in your communities and your organizations. Some of the resources that are there are a way to assess how you're supporting the different dimensions of wellness, a way for you to think about developing your self-care plan, as well as engaging in self-care planning, a document of self-care resources that I've compiled, things like podcasts, books, different individuals who are thought leaders in this area, as well as work around trauma-informed care at the library level and at the community engagement level as well. Thank you so much.